We will begin the webinar momentarily. Would you like to unmute and get us started today? Unmute yourself and then we can.
I thought I did it. All right, thanks. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody, from wherever you're joining us. Welcome to our webinar. This webinar is organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M Universities as part of our Research Spotlight series. The topic of today's webinar is how institutions and non-market actors affect the strategy and performance of multinational enterprises. For this webinar, we invited 3 scholars who have published important work on institutions and non-market strategy. They will discuss their perspectives on this increasingly important area of international business. They will address key research opportunities in this domain and contemporary best practices necessary for publishing work in this area. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated by the co-hosts. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated. I said that. David Griffith and I will be your co-hosts today. David Griffith is the Halle van der Heijden Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing, and Associate Research Director at Cyber at Texas A&M University. His research interests focus on strategy, innovation, global marketing, and international business. He's a fellow of the Academy of International Business and currently serves as an area editor for both the Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science. My name is Ahmet Kırca, and I'm delighted and honored to be here with you today. I'm an associate professor of international business and marketing at Michigan State University Broad College. I also serve as the director of International Business Center MSU Cyber at MSU. First, I would like to thank our participants and panelists for joining us for today's webinar and then introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is Professor Si Chang from Copenhagen Business School. She is an assistant professor of strategy, and her research focuses on non-market strategy, corporate political activities, and global institutions. She studies how firms perceive and adapt to changes in the formal institutional environment, particularly in the international context. Her work has recently been published in one of the leading journals, SMJ, Strategic Management Journal. Our next panelist is Professor Charlie Stevens. Charlie is an associate professor of management and global business at Rutgers Business School. His research focuses on how institutions and social judgments, such as reputation and legitimacy, affect multinational firms' strategy and performance. He's especially interested in these issues in the context of emerging and frontier markets such as Africa and China. His work has been published in journals including Journal of International Business Studies, Strategic Management Journal, and Journal of Management. Our third panelist is Professor Ishva Minafi. Ishva is an assistant professor of business administration at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. His current research projects focus on firms' engagement in socio-political activism in international contexts. His work has been published in journals such as Journal of International Business Studies and Strategic Management Journal. Now I will pass the proverbial microphone to David, who will lead the discussion during the panel. Enjoy.
Thank you, Ahmed. I will simply note for everyone who's in attendance, thank you for coming. Please place questions in the chat or the Q&A. If you want to direct it to one of our speakers, you can use the Q&A and direct it directly to the panel. Without further ado, we're going to turn over the floor to Coco Chang. Coco, please share your screen and take it away.
Sure, thank you, David. Let me try to share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to this series and to talk about the topic of how institutions and non-market actors affect the strategy and performance of multinational enterprises. My name is Coco Chen, and I'm assistant professor at CBS. So today I'm going to talk about the new challenges to the institutional complexity and how do they affect firm strategy nowadays. So we all know that institutions matter for firms, and we also know about the importance of institutional complexity where firms face multiple institutional demands. But I would like to propose here today's institutional complexity is even more complex. Firms face pressures not just from within home institutions and host institutions. They also face pressures from even a broader environment, which is the international institutional environment. And in this environment, geopolitics is currently a major source of complexity. As we all know, all these events happening from every day. And another important characteristics is there are competing institutional logics. So it's not just about market efficiency, it's also about national security. And we could also observe nowadays governments are putting more and more pressure on the extraterritorial reach of multinational companies. And geopolitics basically transfers firm strategy from efficiency focus to legitimacy focus. And I would also like to address that in this increasingly complex institutional environment, supranational institutions are acting more like intermediaries. They are an important platform to facilitate or mediate geopolitics. For instance, some new IGOs are established by the rising power to challenge the existing rules, norms, practices, and missions. And these phenomena actually need to be theorized. So therefore, I'm actually going to use one of my working papers with the title of Contested Multilateralism, New IGOs and Cross-Border M&As, Evidence from the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to elaborate this point. This is a joint work with my co-author, both from ESSEC Business School, Raffaele Canti, and Srividya Jandiala. So to give you some information about the context and my motivation, back in 11 years ago, in 2015, China established this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to challenge the US influence in the global economy. And as it was unsatisfied with its very limited global influence. And many countries back then were very enthusiastic to join the bank. For instance, UK was one of the first Western countries to join the AIIB, and eventually it became a founding member. And that also seems to be a very good news for companies in potential member countries. For example, shares in the South Korea iron and steel firms actually shot up due to potential future contracts that South Korea was considering joining the AIIB. This apparently evoked U.S. strong opposition to this. But if we look back as nowadays, like 11 years later, there are a few voices from the media saying that if the World Bank retreats, could AIIB actually be a substitute? So here we actually argue that AIIB represents a new type of intergovernmental organizations, for short IGOs. And these new IGOs are established by emerging countries to challenge the existing international order. And as this really complicates the picture, do they really offer same benefits to the global economy like existing institutions, like the World Bank, like the IMF? Or do they offer something different? So, what is the implication here for multinational firms? If anything, multinational firms, they are right in the forefront of being affected, maybe much faster and much more than domestic firms. So how does this really affect M&E's investment strategy? So in this working paper, we actually take a look at the literature, what it says about IGOs. IGOs, they have been found by abundant of existing studies to really facilitate investments and transactions among member countries. And this is basically through a normative mechanisms. So because of the contact and collaborations of these member countries, they are found to develop mutually favorable intention. And there's also another study back in 2018 found that member countries actually develop shared norms and values. And eventually, their policies are becoming more and more similar to each other. So, multinational firms could actually benefit from reduced investment risks because the policies from these countries are more aligned and the institutional standards are also established among these member countries. So, eventually, there is a reduction in investment risk. The issue is all these studies, they are based on international institutions established in a US-led unipolar world. So they commonly follow the principles of open markets, free trade, cooperative security, democracy, and liberal values. So these principles basically reflect the US ideology. And now, as the rising power, for instance, China is trying to challenge the US-led order, and the new IGOs are established as a means. These IGOs are contested at their cores, as they were born to challenge the existing order. So the question is, how do they exert the same consequence on multinational firms' investment strategy? So that is the question that we were interested in looking at. How do M&Es respond to countries' participation in these newly established and contested IGOs? I would also like to argue that these contested IGOs, they are a very important phenomenon in the multipolar world. So if we think about the new unipolar era, the US was basically the predominant global power, and it acts like an organizer and a manager of the international order. And that order reflects its political ideology. But in the multipolar world, new economic powers like China emerge and promote their own ideologies. They also want to increase their global influence. And they are targeting for a more balanced distribution of global influence. So for these contested IGOs, the most important thing is to achieve legitimacy. But it's very hard to do so. For what reasons? I will explain. So first, the rising great powers, they have their own political ideologies, and they also want to impose and promote their own norms and values. And that means the diversity. So there's a diversity, and it's very hard for IGOs to generate a unified norm to incorporate all these diversities. And the second reason is IGOs, they're challenging this status quo. They have to attract a broad membership to gain legitimacy. But if to increase this broad membership, that means you have to include countries that are very different from each other. That makes it even harder to create a cohesive order. And in a multipolar system, as the last reason, IGOs may increasingly act as arenas for defending national interests instead of being a platform for normal distribution. So for combining all these reasons, it's very hard to produce shared norms and values like the pre-existing institution IGOs. So it's hard to reduce the investment risk for multinational firms. But I would also like to argue that these contested IGOs still facilitate foreign investment. Instead of a normative mechanism, they could do so through actually transactional mechanism. So the lead country will offer concessions to countries to attract them. For instance, aid, increased trade, or preferential treatment of member countries' firms. These concessions, as a result, will make firms in IGO member countries more appealing targets for foreign acquirers. And I will explain this in the context of AIIB. So AIIB is actually a very good example of contested multilateralism. It's the China-backed investment bank to support its Belt and Road Initiative, and it was also established to challenge the US-led power, to challenge the established financial developed institutions. And it has very different rules and practices. For instance, they only focus on the infrastructure projects, and their loans will at commercial rates, and they don't require borrowing countries to follow any extensive social and environmental standards. This is very different from the traditional model of lending among the current multilateral development banks, where host countries are usually obliged to follow the extensive social and environmental standards. And sometimes the regulatory change is also required in the host country. So as US is strongly opposed to the AIIB, they argue that this bank would only serve as the Chinese political objectives to intervene other countries' internal affair. The result is that still 7 countries joined as founding members, like UK, France, and Germany. And by 2020, the membership has grown up to more than 100 countries. So this wide participation actually was partly due to the concessions made by the Chinese government to other countries. And we also argued that these concessions could make firms located in AIIB member countries more attractive for multinationals' investments for 3 reasons. First, the infrastructure would be improved. These member countries can get more infrastructure in projects, and as these countries are usually developing countries, improvement in infrastructure is very important for the local firms. And then the second reason is the stronger economic ties with China. Multinational firms they could increase their customer base, as China is one of the largest economies in the world. For instance, when Poland joined, they actually expected greater economic access to the Chinese market. And so by investing in these locations, multinational companies could actually get access to these benefits as well. And the third reason is there is a study also showing that there is preferential treatment. Not only can local firms receive higher chance of bidding infrastructure projects, but also this study found that these firms can get higher chance to win an IPO litigation against the Chinese firms even. So as a result, so local firms become more attractive targets for acquisition. And we have our main hypothesis here. A foreign firm is more likely to acquire a target firm located in an AIIB member country. So for our empirical approach, we use firms' cross-border M&A deals between 2010 and 2020 from Thomson Icon, and we have about 500K observations at the acquirer firm, host country, and year level. And for each realized deal here, we include a risk set of countries that consists of a list of potential investment locations. And the dependent variable is the probability of M&A investment of a firm I in country J at a time T. So our treatment variable is the AIB membership, whether you have joined the bank at a year T. And the empirical strategies, so we use staggered DID and we use the linear probability model. The treatment group includes the observations where potential host countries have become a member, and the control group includes observations where potential host countries have not become a member. And this is our main result. We actually found that indeed, on average, firms are about 1% more likely to invest in a country after it has joined the AIB. So 1% seems small, but if we consider the baseline probability of a firm pursuing a cross-border M&A is about 14.5%. This actually translates to 7% increase in the baseline likelihood of investment. To summarize, through this study, we actually found that AIB memberships can substantially increase the likelihood of cross-border M&A investment. And we also show in a multiple award where new IGOs are created to challenge the existing order. These institutions could foster foreign investments through a transactional mechanism, which is different from the normative mechanism promoted by the existing institutions. And we also show that the concessions inherent in this country's decision to join AIB have unintended consequences on multinational firms' investment strategy. So overall, we show a more comprehensive view of geopolitical relationships, and that extends to the previous research by highlighting the neglected aspect of geopolitics. So there is contested multilateralism, and the supranational institutions like new IGOs can serve as intermediaries and to mediate or facilitate the conflicts that we face in the geopolitical arena. And with that, I will close my talk for now. Thank you very much, and welcome for any questions and feedback or comments.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. There are a number of questions for you to look at in the chat, and we'll answer those within the Q&A after all speakers have presented. Please keep the questions coming. Can we have our next speaker take the stage and share your screen, and we can just keep rolling with this. That was excellent. Let's keep it going.
All righty. So can everyone see that?
Yes, sir.
All righty. Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the organizers, thank Charlie for inviting me to be a part of this panel to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my research identity, my heart. And particularly, I've titled this presentation, Advancing a Research Agenda on MNC Socio-Political Activism in Host Countries. And I imagine that most, if not all of us, have seen in the news over the past couple of decades a rise of social movement activism as it relates to various socio-political issues, as mentioned here, racial inequality, LGBTQ plus rights, gun control, abortion rights, you name it. And this has very much affected multinational corporations and domestic firms. And you see a number of firms being pressured by various stakeholders to be responsive. And I think over the past decade in particular, we've witnessed a rise in what we deem as corporate socio-political activism, which we define as the public demonstration of support for or opposition to a socio-political issue. I'll just give a few examples as listed here. Back in 2018 in the US, there was a mass shooting at a high school in Parkland, Florida. This led to a number of firms, including Gucci, to make donations to address this cause. In 2020, you had the murder of George Floyd in the US, and that led to a number of firms, both non-US and American firms, addressing this, such as Michelin, trying to address racism, trying to come up with an action plan to take care of what stakeholders were deeming as important to them. And then more recently in 2023, the government of Uganda enacted an anti-homosexuality bill that led to a number of firms collectively taking a stance and basically criticizing this bill. And so we see this rise of corporate socio-political activism. It's interesting for some researchers, they've seen this as a new form of non-market strategy. Interestingly, Sun and others in the JMS introductory piece, they see it as very complementary to CSR and corporate political activity, particularly when it comes to the distinction between CSR and SBA. It's really a question of what is the controversy. A lot of folks see CSR as less controversial, whereas when it comes to SBA, you're very much taking a stance. You're very much dividing your stakeholders, be it your consumers, your employees, given individuals' differences in moralities and values. And so we're really building upon this. And when I think about the SPA literature, it's interesting. I would argue that approximately 90 to 95% of it is very much focused in domestic context. When we look at the antecedents and the consequences, a number of reviews that have been conducted thus far. And so this really led me to raise that question, especially if we think about the examples just mentioned, whether it's Michelin, whether it's Gucci, these multinational firms engaging in SBA. Should we take a look at this in the realm of IB? So I've been trying to push this agenda. I'd say it started very recently. This is a call to action for everyone on the call and beyond. But along with a co-author, Lori Yu, we basically looked at the antecedents of whether or not a multinational would be consistent or inconsistent in its SBA across host countries, home and host countries. So to give the example, if you were a multinational from the US being responsive to the BLM movement in the summer of 2020, were you responsive to a similar incident in Brazil in November of 2020? Consistency versus inconsistency. And we look at the notion of within country institutional complexity as well as across country institutional complexity to address this particular phenomenon. And so I'd say that that's really the start of this research agenda. And as I see it, and I lay it out for you all here, that's looking at the antecedents. We can also think about the consequences of MNC's engagement in socio-political activism in various host countries, particularly when you think about various stakeholder groups reacting to, responding to firms' engagement, but also something that we do not talk about enough of, I would argue, in the socio-political activism literature is this notion of misalignment between the headquarters and the subunits or the affiliates of a firm or a multinational corporation. And then lastly, just thinking about even if there is alignment, I think what's interesting about multinationals is who's speaking up? Is it the headquarters or the subsidiary or the affiliate? And are they framing these issues as local or global? And so what I'll do for the remainder of my time is really walk through the consequences and framing strategies, some ideas that I have with regards to these topics or subtopics. I probably spend most time thinking about a specific working paper that a couple of co-authors and I have right now, basically looking at the consequence of a firm or multinational engaging in activism in a host country. and really trying to advance this notion, this new concept of the home country value fit. So I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide. But basically, when you see a multinational corporation or its affiliates engage in socio-political activism, how do the host country consumers respond? Do they view it, particularly if it's consistent or inconsistent with the home country's values associated with that particular issue? And so we're drawing on two different theories or two different streams of literature: expectancy violations theory and country of origin perceptions. Now, I know that's pretty broad, so just to make this a bit more concrete for everybody, we're looking at this in the context of MNC affiliates' stances with regards to the Hong Kong pro-democracy protest in 2019, 2020. If you think back to that time, there's a lot of international news coverage. Basically, an extradition bill was put on the table for fugitives coming from different locations within the region. A lot of individuals within Hong Kong protested this bill. And so we saw it as a pro-democracy movement, basically a belief that this bill was infringing upon their rights, their civil rights as individuals. This led to a lot of pressure on multinationals and their affiliates that were operating in the context to either take a stand for or against the movement. And so we have some data, particularly within the restaurant industry. So you think about the Starbucks of the world, McDonald's, and other Cinnabon, others that are operating in this context. And basically, it became a question of whether or not they took a stand for or against, and consumers basically perceiving, well, if you're coming from a high democracy home country, you should be in favor of this movement and what the consequences would be if you were or were not. And so just to illustrate that, you think about Starbucks all across the region. Its franchisor basically took a stance against the pro-democracy movement. It was more so in favor of the local government, China and Hong Kong. This led to a lot of backlash, a lot of destruction to a number of their outlets throughout the context. And if you get into activists and consumers' words and their language and their communication about it, it's because it was this belief that Starbucks is coming from the US, a place that has ideals towards democracy, yet the firm itself was not being in support of this particular issue. So that's what we really mean by this notion of home country value fit. So in terms of the findings, in terms of the consequences of this particular issue, this particular case, if an MNC or its affiliate adopted a pro-movement stance and they were coming from a high democracy country, it's relatively positive response in terms of consumers' ratings of that firm within the restaurant industry. Interestingly, even if you took that same stance in support of the movement, but you were from a low democracy country, the response was more muted. And again, getting into individuals' actual statements about this is basically this notion of skepticism, inauthenticity. Well, they're coming from Thailand, but they're taking this stand. We don't believe that Thai firms are actually in favor of democracy. They're just doing this more so for PR to gain benefits economically. So it's really interesting from an expectancy violations theory perspective that typically if you engage in a positive violation, you would be received positively. In this context, it's actually the opposite. You're actually seen as inauthentic. On the flip side, if you adopted an anti-movement stance and you were from a high democracy country, it's typically negative. And that's really speaking to that Starbucks example. They're perceived as American, they are American, and they're not aligned with local consumers. On the flip side, if you were from a low democracy country, the response was a bit more muted, and that's supposed to be expected. No one's expecting you to support this movement. given your background of your country. And so broadly, just taking all of this together, I think it's really interesting to look at the consequences of firms' engagement in activism and see how home country values may be shaping individuals' perceptions of such responses. So that's what we're getting at within this study. Now, also thinking about the realm of consequences, I mentioned this notion of socio-political misalignment within MNCs. I think we've really seen this over the past couple of years. And just to give you all a few examples, probably most recently and most saliently, this notion of Ben and Jerry's. Basically, the CEO was fired, many would argue, because of Ben and Jerry's being known as a politically active firm in the US, well, as a subsidiary of Unilever, British firm. They ended up firing him because of this misalignment, because of this difference. Similarly, I think what we've seen in the US over the past year, broadly speaking, due to the regulatory environment, the new political administration, a number of firms reneging on their DEI stances, their DEI commitments, their DEI goals, and McDonald's US, the headquarters, being one of those firms. Interestingly enough, McDonald's UK said, no, we're going to actually stick with our DEI goals and commitments, even though our counterparts has done something differently. And we refuse to copy, as this headline argues. And last example here would be, I don't know about you all, if you know CrossFit, I'm into fitness. And so I've been to CrossFit gyms. I'm a firm believer in doing research that also ties to your personal interests. So I've interviewed individuals who are in the US, but also in Canada in terms of their decisions to leave CrossFit affiliate system when the founder of CrossFit back in 2020 made some very racially insensitive and controversial remarks in the wake of George Floyd's death. And so you see this misalignment, broadly speaking. And for me, I see this as a potential to integrate agency theory, agency conflict for sure. You also have, from the flip side, from the perspective of the affiliates, their organizational identity. Do we want to stay within this system, within this multinational corporation? So we're trying to develop a framework on the implications. Because by and large, what we're typically seeing is reputational consequences, and yes, by extension, economic consequences. But you have a number of social movement activists and other stakeholders who very much see firms as inconsistent, particularly inconsistent in their values when you have this misalignment. So you want to have a dual perspective. From the headquarters perspective, do you reduce your resource allocation, which we've seen in some cases? Do you specifically cut ties with the affiliate? On the flip side, for the affiliate, we've also seen examples of the affiliates publicly, criticizing the CEO or the headquarters for a controversial stance, or as in the case of CrossFit, cutting ties with the entire firm. And so that's something I want to push forward because, again, I think when it comes to work on corporate socio-political activism, we very much have this notion that the headquarters and the subunits are aligned in their views. And that typically is because we're just looking at domestic context, i.e. the US. And I think we need to go beyond that. And then lastly, quickly, with regards to framing strategies, again, you do see alignment between headquarters and subunits in most cases. And so it is an open question, who is to speak out? Is it to be the headquarters CEO? Is it to be the subsidiary CEO? And what are the implications of that? What does that signal to various stakeholder groups? But also, I think there's this notion, are socio-political issues framed as local or global? You think about climate change, you think about racial inequity, you think about LGBTQ plus rights. Is it local? Is it global? And what institutional factors might influence this framing distinction? And so I've recently collected data on non-US firms, non-US MNCs, responses to the BLM movement in 2020. And so, as you see depicted here, yes, most of the protests were in the US, but they were also across the globe. And so, it's an open question for multinationals that were responsive. Was this just a US issue? Did they see this as a global issue? And so I'm really particularly interested in getting into the responses of European firms, given the histories of race and slavery across the continent. And so just a few ideas, few projects that I'm working on. Again, call to action in terms of our need and my belief and our need to look at and examine multinational corporations' engagement in socio-political activism. I think it will contribute to our broader and more collective understanding of activism uh, just across the globe. And I think about IB in particular. I think the notion of perceived and actual differences in socio-political values is extremely salient. And I think there's room to actually look into these differences to help us understand how MNCs and their affiliates engage and communicate with regards to the SBA, as well as the consequences associated with that SBA. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen, say thank you, and I look forward to your feedback and questions.
That was incredible. Very, very thought-provoking. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Excellent. To our last speaker, Charlie, you want to take over?
Yep, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me get my slides up here. Let's see. Can you see my slides?
Looks great.
Perfect. All right, here we go. It's a pleasure to be here today. It was funny as Coco and Ishvo were presenting, I was just smiling a bit because I feel like what we've worked on together. There's just such complementarities. I was thinking about what I'm going to speak to. Really fits in with what's already been said. I remember we actually had a planning meeting a couple of weeks ago. I think we blocked off an hour or so to kind of align what we were doing, and after about 10 minutes, it's like, I think we're good. I think this all fits together really well. So what I'm going to talk about today really, I think, segues nicely, talking about kind of MNEs, continuing the conversation about MNEs and their engagement with local institutions, local market and non-market actors. But in a little bit different context. I'm going to kind of provide some broader kind of overview insights and ideas for future research based on a project, an ongoing decade plus long project I've been working on in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at how foreign MNEs deal with some of these engagement issues. So let me jump in here. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the issue of impact, and especially in emerging frontier markets. So places like the areas that I look at a lot in East Africa, for instance. There's a lot of pressure on the foreign MNEs that come into these countries and societies to provide positive impact. In many cases, the local government doesn't have the capability or the capacity to really address and deal with pressing social issues. Maybe it's poverty, maybe it's health-related issues, maybe it's infrastructure, whatever it might be. Local firms, in many cases, are smaller and don't have the ability to do this. And so people look at the companies that come in from overseas to provide this kind of impact. But the problem is, and we know from decades of research on this, that in many cases and many different theories explain why many firms' instincts kind of run counter to deepening their engagement in what might be considered quote unquote, risky locations, that firms are more likely to tread lightly when there's this kind of risk involved. I was thinking about even what Ishra was talking about when a lot of firms were very eager to engage on issues when they perceived it as relatively low risk. But even in the U.S., you see this huge U-turn once the risk level ratchets up, and firms say, well, maybe we need to rethink our engagement on different issues. I think in especially say emerging contexts, emerging countries, we have research on how firms sometimes get tempted to engage in misbehavior, whether it's corruption, whether it's maybe taking advantage of weaker environmental laws and enforcement. And so you had this tension, this conflict where the firms, the M&Es, are looked to as being a potential solution to different grand challenges and wicked problems that we talk about in IB. And when you talk to the firms themselves, they want to be perceived as a part of the solution. Again, whether it's for reputational issues, financial issues, legitimacy issues, and reasons, they want to be seen as part of the solution. And yet they're under an increasing kind of magnifying glass, increasing scrutiny that their contributions are inadequate and in some cases seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So this has been an interesting issue to look at, and so I've been engaged in this series of papers, kind of an ongoing project with my friend and colleague Aloysius Kahindi at the University of Victoria. This is joint work with him, so I have to credit Aloysius as well. We've been working on looking at how foreign firms navigate these kinds of tensions and challenges across a few different, what fall into different buckets in terms of research streams within ID, from political risk or IB in terms of political risk and corruption, liability of foreignness. There's been a lot of work lately on M&E societal impact. We take or we do qualitative research, really try to interview and get the perspectives of both the M&Es, but also the local perspective as well, to understand how these firms' impact is viewed. And what's been an interesting common thread across these different studies, even though the focal phenomenon might be a little bit different, is that we really see the existence of what we term engagement strategies, where not all firms, and probably not even a majority of firms, but many firms, more than expected, are working to really embed themselves more deeply, even in these, again, quote unquote, risky locations. And they do it not just out of the interest of their own heart. The best of their own heart is also to increase acceptance of the firm, gain legitimacy, increase their bargaining power. But you have these firms that are deciding to engage more, even when many of their rivals or colleagues are not. But we see that these firms, in many cases, face different obstacles, different challenges to trying to create and execute these engagement strategies, which is obviously a big problem for the firms. But as researchers, it's always great to have tension, conflict, and really try to understand what's going on and how this advances, our understanding of issues relating to M&Es, strategies, market and non-market strategies in emerging markets, with dealing with local stakeholders and managing those relationships there. So I just wanted to share some kind of maybe bigger picture insights, but also dive into some specifics too on what we've learned over more than a decade of looking at these issues in East Africa. And one of the things that has been interesting to see, especially when you look at the literature on these kinds of issues, is that there's kind of a strange and often unacknowledged bifurcation, if you will, in the literature, in the sense that you have a number of studies that focus on the issue of isomorphism, and that when you have these various institutions, in order to gain legitimacy, you need to, whether it's when in Rome, do as the Romans do, or to become isomorphic with global best practices, whether it's maybe ISO certification or adopting certain CSR practices. But then you have this other literature, which maybe they focus on institutional entrepreneurship or institutional work. I think a lot of non-market strategy fits in this area too, where we kind of assume that the firm has a lot of agency to maybe not quite do whatever they want, but they're able to shape institutions or do things in a way that makes sense for them. But what we have found is that there is probably kind of more of a middle ground here, where the firms probably have, as foreign firms coming in, they have maybe more agency than some, especially more traditional neo-institutional iron cage type perspectives might think, more agency than that. But they also don't have complete freedom, especially again as foreign firms coming in to do whatever they want. And so what that means is that we've uncovered kind of an interesting role for intermediaries. So Coco mentioned kind of some big, kind of institutional level intermediaries. We find kind of a much more kind of micro level intermediary in our context a lot. Kind of an I think underappreciated intermediary, and that would be the local workers for the MNEs that a lot of times get overlooked, I think, in research on MNEs. But in many cases, they're embedded in these two different locations. They're embedded in the firm, they're embedded in the local context, and in many cases, they're the ones who are able to act as this agent of change for firms, especially if they're trying to engage more with a local context, for example. I think another interesting finding is that, even, saying about Ishva's table he had on CSR, for example, and doing good. But in many cases, when you kind of uncover, what's really going on, the focus in many cases is actually more of a do no harm approach, mitigate environmental damage or something like that. And in many cases, it's not necessarily providing positive impact. Firms are just trying to kind of fit in and go along. But when we talk, especially to local actors, they say, hey, we need a lot of help, and we want firms to actually do something, not just provide negative impact or be these zero, net zero actors, but to really provide some kind of positive impact and actually do good. But again, for firms, in many cases, that's more of a commitment. That's more of a challenge for them in many situations. Another interesting thing that we've really uncovered is that in many cases the firms don't even really know what's expected of them or what people want from them. Even the firms that do go in with the intention of providing positive impact, in many cases they don't know or they think they know, but they actually don't know what, say, local, community members or government officials might be looking for from them. So, for example, we found in our context that many local stakeholders were hoping from the firm to have more in the way of what you might call more kind of intangible benefits. So things like promoting kind of self-reliance and empowerment, longer term impacts like providing training and skills rather than just providing jobs. And in many cases, there'd be these disconnects where the firms would get frustrated. You talk to expats, talk to country managers for big M&Es, and they'd say, we're doing all these different things, and yet people are still angry at us. They're protesting, they're looting, they're shutting down the factories, they're striking. But we're doing all these great things. Why don't they understand what we're trying to do here? And in many cases, it's a situation where there's a disconnect between what the firm thinks is expected of them and what actually is. There's very large and I think again underappreciated differences with respect to engagement, depending on where firms are coming from. So again, I think you got a bit of a preview of that from Coco's presentation, where she was talking about China, through some of the IGOs like the AIIB, just the role, the involvement of the Chinese government, for example, is very different from what the U.S. does. It's very different from the UK or Germany. It's not just China, though. India has a large presence and has had a large diaspora presence in Africa, East Africa in particular, for a long time. Turkey is there, the UAE is there. Firms, in many cases, state-owned enterprises from Vietnam, Malaysia are there. And so different companies are following different playbooks with respect to engagement. They're also learning from each other. So, we see US firms collaborating with Chinese firms on Belt and Road Initiative projects, for example, engaging in ways that I think in many cases don't get talked about as much, which makes for, again, interesting um, constellations of strategies here. Then the final point I wanted to make here on things that we found is I think we need to understand that, when we talk about emerging economies, developing countries, there's more to variation across these countries than just their GDP per capita, for example. Understanding the difference between, countries that are, extremely, not just volatile, but, just fundamentally, maybe unstable and unpredictable. Understanding differences in education levels, understanding differences in tribal and ethnic differences and dynamics that I think in many ways have lessons not just for this particular context, but in an increasingly polarized world. I think in many ways we've gotten more tribal than we might have thought we were. And I think there's a lot of lessons from Africa for many other parts of the world. So that I think leads to a number of really interesting opportunities for future research in this area. I know for us, one thing that we're trying to understand better is why some firms will get involved with these engagement strategies while others won't. And I think a key issue is to understand better, some of the different frictions that arise that might prevent firms from getting engaged versus, which firms are able to create synergies across maybe it's their market versus their non-market strategy, and balancing, desires for impact versus the need for profitability. That Ishva, I feel like I owe you $10 for setting up this issue well of the headquarters subsidiary dynamics is I think there's an increasing interest. I think in the last 5 years or so, in particular, I've seen more papers in IB that have really looked at the subsidiary as a focal actor. But I think we need more of that because they are on the front line with non-market strategies, with stakeholder strategies, and local engagement. And there's like you said, Ishva, the headquarters and subsidiary are not always on the same page, and there can be a lot of tension between those actors. Um, the dark side of engagement. There's a big difference between a firm kind of getting their hands dirty and pitching in and providing, positive impact versus just having dirty hands. Because, actors like intermediaries, we found to be really helpful for firms to engage and have positive impact. But they can also be a conduit for bribery, for nepotism, for, all kinds of misconduct as well. And sometimes often it can be hard for firms to separate kind of the positive forms of engagement from some of the more negative sides of it. I think that we need to look more at, I didn't have IGOs on here, but, NGOs, other actors, think about NGOs in particular, many times get put into the conversation in terms of issues relating to impact. In many cases, firms rely on NGOs to help provide, to do CSR or form, other forms of impact. But at least in our context, there is a lot of skepticism about NGOs and the misalignment that often occurs between the priorities and goals and objectives of the NGOs versus those of local stakeholders. Geopolitics, great power competition, for the countries such as ours that we look at that are not great powers, that are caught between the great powers, China, the US, Russia, you name it. How do they navigate those situations, and how do the firms navigate these higher level, battles and issues between governments? And then finally, understanding not just the firm perspective, which, I think we tend to do because we're management and business scholars, we tend to look at these things from the perspective of the firm, understandably. But we have to also understand the local perspective too, if we really want to understand which strategies are going to work, what the impacts will be for, again, market and non-market performance, we have to understand the local perspective as well. So with that, I look forward to engaging more, as we say in East Africa, Asante Sana, thank you, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. If you can take on your share screen, will be
Yep.
good. So here's what we're going to do with the remaining 30 minutes. There have been a lot of questions that have come in. I'm going to ask first specific questions that have been raised to the different panelists. So I'll kind of go through the same order of the panelists, and then I'm going to ask some broader questions that have come up that I think are appropriate. And I think everyone would enjoy hearing all of your perspectives on those. All right. So the first question is going to go to Coco. And in terms of your research, how do you distinguish whether the acquisitions are driven by AIIB related institutional changes versus general improvements in infrastructure and growth?
Yeah, thank you very much. So this is a great question. To respond to this point, we actually so if you remember the table that I showed in the slides, we actually find the effects increases 1 year, like right after the countries have joined the IB. So if there's a material improvement in infrastructure and growth, we would not expect the effect to happen so fast after they join the bank. So usually to build infrastructure projects, you need a lot more years. If the effect is materialistic instead of symbolic, then we would observe only the effect a few years after. So in our case, it's not like that. So we would argue this is truly a symbolic. It's only the multinational firms' expectation of the local countries to improve in the future. Then they started investing in these countries.
Excellent, thank you. There was a request for all the speakers, if you feel comfortable sharing your slide deck, to drop them into the chat. If you don't feel comfortable, please don't, but if you do, drop them into the chat. With that, I'm going to go to our next question, which is for Shiva. Wouldn't it be rational for firms not to respond to a social movement if the momentum is weak? If that's the case, A, would it be worth separating social political response into active when the movement is strong versus passive when the movement is weak?
Yep. Thank you for that question. I see it as coming from a cost benefit analysis perspective. Like, oh, if there is no tension, why respond at all? I think you will always have stakeholders who are identifying with a movement. And so I think there's a consideration for them. And if it's a small segment, then yeah, maybe you as a firm could ignore it. I think what's interesting about many of these movements, we often think about them at the country level. But if I think about specific issues, take anti-LGBTQ issues in the US, that might be state to state onwards up to the national, the federal level. And so it might seem small scale and you might be able to ignore it early on. But if this becomes more national, I think there's the potential for stakeholders to say, okay, you're responding to it later, but actually we believe that you're inauthentic. You've been inconsistent, you were silent, and now you're speaking up. And so I think timing matters. Yes, the notion of weak or high or low or weak or strong momentum speaks to issue salience. Typically, what we see is firms responding when there is a highly salient issue. I think we have to look at the trajectory, and I think firms are considering that. So they likely are less responsive when it's low momentum, but there are consequences if you wait to respond, I would say.
Excellent, thank you. Charlie, how do engagement strategies vary between resource rich, I'm sorry, the chat's moving on me, the research rich states versus the fragile states and the more institutionally developed African economies?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so yeah, I was thinking about one of our more recent studies that came out last year, where we look at firms' reputations that they developed for providing societal impact, relating to their engagement. And I think one of the real tragedies is that in the countries where that impact is needed most. So in our context, we look at countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Um, I'd say also countries like Burundi, Uganda, South Sudan fit in this context where there's a lot of instability there. And we see less engagement in those countries for, I'd say, two reasons. One, many companies see, increased risk, but the other challenge is that they see less reward in the sense that, if you're doing good deeds in a conflict zone, in many cases, people are too busy focused on the conflict, to say, hey, this company's doing great things here, that it flies under the radar. And conversely, firms that are probably engaged in worse behavior also fly under the radar. So the firms see it worth their while to engage more in the more stable countries. And again, that's kind of regardless of economic development. So Rwanda is a country that's probably one of the most stable in our context, GDP per capita of about $1,000 per year, and yet firms tend to be more engaged in Rwanda because it's more stable institutionally as well.
Excellent, thank you. So we're going to go through one more round of specific questions before we move to more general questions. So back to Coco. Does AIIB membership make local firms more attractive because of future growth potential or because of political protection?
Thank you for this question again. So I actually think there's not so much about political protection, because in this case, I would worry more about the political intervention of China. As countries are not so familiar with the Chinese approach as foreign policies, actually, I think they are more worried about being politically intervened of Chinese government into their foreign and internal affairs. But there indeed is two directions. So either you're benefiting from connecting to the Chinese economy, you're benefiting economically. On the other side, you're worried about the increasing risk because of the political intervention, the potential political intervention by China. So in this case, again, I think it's symbolic, and I think it's in as our results find it's more about economic growth, and it's not so much about political intervention. And I would less argue about political protection in this case. But thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Shiva, how do you operationalize or measure a firm's stance on social political issues? And I'm going to combine this with another question that was asked, which is, so if you're thinking about that operationalization, there was a paper in the Journal of Marketing in 2020 that sort of broke down corporate social political activism in terms of words versus actions. So
Yeah.
both just sort of being this
Yeah.
general operationalization.
Yep. Thanks for combining them, David, because I was going to combine them as well. So that works out perfectly. Absolutely. So to both questions, there are various ways to operationalize things. I think there are multiple layers to it. And I think it starts with Jordan's question. First, there's the notion of, is a firm just making a public statement about their values related to an issue? For a lot of researchers and activists, that's seen as very symbolic, especially if that statement does not include any actions that the firm is engaging in. Actions are often deemed as substantive. And then once you get into the substantive realm, now you can break that down. And I don't think we've seen a lot of that per se in terms of distinguishing what's, a higher level of substantive activism versus what's a lower level. It's really tough to compare, hiring a chief diversity officer relative to giving a donation. Now, obviously, when it comes to the category of donations as substantive activism, you can look at the amounts and you can quantify things and compare things. But in terms of across substantive behaviors, I think that's a bit more difficult. And we haven't really seen it done a lot. You just have the notion of researchers saying a firm engaged or they didn't engage. They did so symbolically, they did so substantively. And I think one next step that we could take is, well, the diversity of actions. Are you engaging in a number of different actions for a particular socio-political issue? And then last thing I'll say is even among the statements, I have seen one paper, I think more so in micro-organizational behavior, particularly in the realm of DEI and the BLM movement, where they had costly statements. And so if you actually named someone who was killed by the police, if you actually named racism for what it is, that was seen as costly because it could be perceived by stakeholders as negatively affecting your reputation, for example. So thank you both for those questions.
Excellent. Charlie, when you talk about firm level heterogeneity, what kinds of firms seem better at turning engagement into a win-win rather than a trade-off?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the studies that we've done, we've found a few different things. So for example, um, we found that firms, so there are, for example, firms that have are not just relying on local stakeholders, say, as the workforce, but also as the customer base. So this could be more service-oriented firms, for example, say, telecom firms, things like that, things that are also selling phones, not just, manufacturing phones there. They tended to be the ones that were best able to really adjust and learn and roll out different initiatives that actually fit what people were interested in. So the industry mattered. We saw country of origin differences as well. I mean, again, to be honest, it's like we found a number of other firms from other developing countries, including China, that tended to take a longer term perspective and tended to have more of a ecosystem, whether it was things like the AIIB, whether it was the involvement of the home government, whether it was a greater likelihood to engage in coalitions with other firms rather than try to engage alone. We found that a number of other developing country firms tended to engage better. But at the same time, what I think is interesting is that it was a dynamic process. So you might see those firms first have success, but then say you're a U.S. firm, a European firm, not all, but many would look at that and say, okay, what can we learn from that? Okay, that's different from what we've done, but we can also adapt. So there is this kind of evolution that is interesting to see, kind of post-entry, to kind of bring in another question I see here, that these post-entry strategies really do evolve for these firms. But the question for me is to I don't know why this given firm from this country, this industry might follow this strategy, but a firm from the same industry, same home country might take a different approach. I think that probably involves a lot more kind of fine-grained analysis there.
Excellent, excellent. Now I'm going to open this next question up. It's a big question. It's a really big question. It's one of those questions that when I get in my EMBA class, I'm like, well, it's going to depend upon a lot of things. And given that it's a big question, I think it's a great question. I'm going to start with Charlie because I've known Charlie the longest. And so I'm going to put Charlie on the spot on this
I
one.
feel like this student is like, don't call on me, don't call on me.
I saw you hiding over there, buddy.
So I put myself
So
on mute. So
So I'm going to start
yeah,
with Charlie and then
yeah.
reverse the order, and then we're going to transition into some how to get things published kind of discussion. All right. So the question is, how do NGOs and civil society organizations, movements, whatever we want to think them as, affect M&E strategies differently? And now this poses it across developed or emerging markets, but I would kind of ask us to think about how do these things just affect everything differently as you look at all different country markets that you're going to operate in? Like you said, big question. Charlie, what do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I mentioned briefly that in my context, NGOs in many cases are looked on with some suspicion in terms of again misalignment in many cases, at least in some cases, between um, the NGO and local desires. Um, so I mean, I think that's one way that it can be, they can serve as a useful intermediary between the firm and the local society community, to help get things done, especially if that NGO has a lot of local experience, they have local knowledge. But I think in some cases they can be this source of interference, if you will, too, where, if the firm is getting, advice that again fits more with what the NGO is looking for. So, for example, a number of NGOs tend to focus more on kind of mitigating harms, again, like, cutting emissions, these kinds of things, which, is important, but many local stakeholders would say, okay, we understand there's going to be some pollution here, but if you provide, skills training and this and that, we're willing to accept that for sure, for example. So their NGOs definitely play a role. There's a lot of heterogeneity within across NGOs that I think we need to understand better as well. But they can help, they can hurt. But in many cases, in our context at least, people want the firms to engage directly with them. They don't want them to use the NGOs as this kind of outsourcing our CSR to. They want the firms to engage directly.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I appreciate you also taking a first stab at that one.
Of course.
Yeshiva?
Yep, I'll jump in. So when I think about socio-political activism, NGO pressure can be extremely high, it can be low. And I think what we tend to see is that NGOs collectively come together to put pressure on firms. I think where the difference is, I may be taking like the opposite end of the question is where we see differences in firms' responses across different markets. And so in more open or quote unquote developed markets, firms feel that pressure, they may be more apt to being responsive. In more quote unquote closed markets where it's like, oh, are you worried about governmental backlash, the local host government's backlash? Some firms are typically, let's say most firms are typically silent in those situations, or what you will start to see is an engagement in more collective action. So if I take the example that I posed on the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda, a very closed market, particularly when it comes to that issue, no one in terms of firms really spoke out individually. They actually banded together this coalition called Open for Business. They put a statement together. And so I do think you see that. Think about what's going on right now, a lot of pressure with regards to what's happening in Minneapolis with regards to immigration and ICE. Minnesota based or Minneapolis based firms didn't say anything with regards to first death, Renee Good, then Alex, his death. I think the next day you saw a collective statement because there's still a worry about local governmental pressure, but also national governmental pressure, even though you have a lot of high NGO pressure and a lot of protests. And so I think the context matter, although the pressure could be uniform in terms of NGOs. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Coco, what are your thoughts?
So my first intuition was if we were talking about the extent, then I think, of course, NGOs or civil society organizations are more perceived in developed countries than emerging markets. Then that leads to my second intuition. Actually, I think it maybe depends on two factors. One is how NGOs and civil society organizations are perceived in these two types of markets. And the second factor is how M&Es are perceived in these two markets. And then you can plot a 2 by 2 matrix. So for instance, if these organizations are well perceived in an emerging market, and then M&E itself, this emerging market is also important for M&E, then of course, how NGOs and civil society organizations behave matter for them. But if we think about NGOs are not well perceived in the emerging market, and this market is also not important for M&E, then maybe what they do, what these organizations do, are not so influential for NGOs. So I think really depends on who are the audience. Like if we're talking about the legitimacy of M&E's behaviors, who are really perceiving this legitimacy, who are the audience of these companies and these organizations.
Excellent. Wow. Fabulous. Thank you all for handling that one. So we're going to keep in that order of Charlie, Shiva, and Coco on this next round, if we could. And we got about 10 minutes left, so I kind of want to keep answers relatively short, but they're going to be complex questions. So as a scholar who is interested in publishing work in the area of institutions and non-market actors, what is your advice? And all three of you will answer the same question. What is your advice as to being able to isolate an effect, given that there are a lot of different institutional elements and there are a lot of different non-governmental actors. And so when you're trying to study one thing, how do you go about sort of making sure that what you're capturing is what you think you're capturing?
Oh, that's a big. Thanks, David. I get it. Yeah, it is hard because I think all so many of these things, obviously, it can be so easy to think in this big systems approach. I think about some papers of mine that have started that way, and especially with some qualitative work I do, it's so easy to you want to tell this big complex story because it is, and then you have reviewers that say, focus. So, I mean, I think in terms of kind of thinking about advice in terms of publishing is, I think to have that big systemic picture in your mind, but to try to think about what piece within that is the most interesting to you, the most surprising to you, that feels that it's the most counterintuitive in terms of what existing research or theory would predict. For us in kind of I think an interesting geographic context of East Africa, thinking about okay, what's kind of unique and interesting about this setting that could, like I was saying, with tribalism and polarization, have maybe interesting or unexpected lessons for a broader context. But finding what's the most interesting, what are people reacting to the most and asking the most questions as you tell them about the research interests that you have. Focus on those, and you can always get more complex later, but start with what's most interesting.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie.
Yep. I might cheat in terms of how do we isolate things? Because I, like Charlie, also do a lot of qualitative work. And so I think very much in a configurational manner, and I want to get into FSQCA. And so from an empirical perspective, trusting my co-authors who are very strong with diff and diff to isolate things. And of course, it comes down to a very interesting research question. What is new? What is the new mechanism? And I think we have been able to do that in the realm of CPA or SPA, excuse me, but also the cheating part is I am really into like theory development, and I think theory development, and particularly the piece with Lori, theory piece and Jibs, allows you to be a bit more broader in your perspective to set the agenda, so that hopefully others can take the pieces moving forward. But so I like both. Yep.
Excellent, excellent. And for our attendees who are interested in QCA, if you go check the prior recordings, Ahmed and I hosted a QCA webinar. Coco, back to that question.
Yeah, a very interesting question. And I also think this question does not only apply to NGOs, but also apply to any other phenomenons or contexts. And I actually want to agree with Charlie, like just do whatever that interests you, and then like really find what is your insight into this phenomenon if you're interested in a particular context or phenomenon, and then try to find. Yeah, that sounds cliche. Try to find how that could be generalized to other contexts, but first of all, find those that really interest you.
Excellent. Okay, so this is going to be the last question. It's kind of a two-parter. I'm going to start with Charlie again, and just you know, keep your advice as direct as you can. What is for people trying to publish in this area? What is one thing you would recommend that they do? And what is one thing you would recommend that they don't do in terms of when they're positioning their work and presenting their work to the review team?
Yeah, it's a good question. In terms of the do, I'll try to keep it direct. I mean, find good data. Yeah, I mean, I know that it sounds so cliche, but and so this is maybe, and let me just give one answer because it's part do, part don't. And this might sound obvious, but it's like you read papers that maybe promise something really exciting, and then they use this really kind of macro level data set that, maybe it's kind of the World Bank governance index, or things like that there's great data sets for certain purposes, but don't allow you to do that really deep, nuanced dive into the kinds of issues that I think we're talking about today. Um, so really, figure out, I was trained as a quantitative scholar. I have shifted over to qualitative because I tried to get the quantitative data to tell me what I wanted to, but it just I was torturing data and trying to make it cry, and I just ended up crying myself. So figuring out kind of what's the right data methodology to answer the kinds of questions you want.
Excellent. That is a great do and don't combined into one. Nice job. Yeshiva?
I'm sorry, I have to piggyback off of Charlie, but as soon as I wrote down my last word to the first part of that response, Charlie mentioned it. Absolutely, data. I think grabbing or trying your best to get great data in a really interesting context is what I think speaks to a number of reviewers in the AE, such that you can ideally get at least a revise and resubmit opportunity. And secondly, this might be more general, not just for this topic, but I never submit to a journal without getting feedback, especially when it comes to a new phenomenon, because I might be thinking of something as very phenomenon driven, but there's not enough theory. And I think that friendly reviewers or audiences help me to bring in the theory, especially for these types of phenomena.
That's a great point, getting a second set of eyes on your
Yeah.
work. We get so involved in what we're
Yeah.
doing, we see it this way, and it's perfectly clear to us.
Yeah.
So excellent point. Coco?
Yeah, so I think Ishiva and Charlie has already touched on this a little bit. I think one advice if I could give is to work with good causes. Yeah, so and don't put yourself under too much pressure. It's not, if you're working with good causes, you can cry with them together if things don't go well.
Oh, that is perfect. And that's a great way to end our webinar. So if I could just say we are so appreciative of all three of you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. It was absolutely incredible to learn from you today. I want to thank all of our attendees who came to the webinar. I hope that it was valuable to you. I clearly want to thank my partner, Amit Gurja, who has weighed with me these last few years on this, and we could not do this without the support of the staff and leadership at the Texas A&M Center for International Business Studies and the Michigan State University International Business Center and the cyber at MSU that Amit heads. So I want to thank everyone for just coming with us on this journey. It's been wonderful. Amit, I'll leave the last words for you. If you
Yes, I'm mute again, right? All right, David, thank you so much. This was a very informative discussion, and you did such a great job of moderating this entire discussion. Coco, Charlie, and Ishva, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your useful thoughts and research ideas on institutions and non-market strategy. As I mentioned before, I cannot thank David and his team at Texas A&M University Cyber for doing such a great job as a moderator of this event and planners for this particular event. I would also like to thank the participants for joining us for this interesting panel and for the questions that we have received. This was probably one of the most active sessions we have had recently. And I would like to thank my team at MSU Cyber for helping us to promote the event as well. So we're looking forward to seeing you again in one of our Research Spotlight webinars in the future. Thank you for joining and hope to see you in the future.
Thank you, everyone.